There's a tiny country covering an area of approximately 11,000 square miles on the west coast of Central Africa. This nation is sitting on a vast amount of oil that has led to some referring to it as Africa's Kuwait. On one part of the country is a 6-lane highway stretching from the airport to a multi-million-dollar seaside resort lined with skyscrapers, a state-of-the-art Israeli-run hospital, and luxury homes surrounded by carefully tended gardens. The other side of the country, however, looks like this. People living in wooden tents, children jumping up and down close to sewage that flows right onto dirt road filled with trash. No clean water. 20% of the children die before the age of 5. A record number of them don't even know what a school looks like. This sharp contrast paints the picture of Equatorial Guinea. Immense oil wealth alongside crushing poverty. For almost 45 years, this guy, President Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo, the world's longest serving head of state, has ruled this tiny African country with an iron fist. But the question is, how has one man and his family dynasty managed to hold on to power for so long, and at what cost? I want to tell you the story of this 82-year-old tyrant and how his Nguema dynasty continues to plunder the wealth of this small African country. We'll go through documents that show how international actors from global banks and oil corporations to foreign governments and mercenaries enabled Obiang's regime. This will help you understand why the people of this tiny African country continue to face deep poverty, repression, and the denial of basic freedom despite their country's vast resource wealth. This is the story of how Teodoro Obiang stole Equatorial Guinea. To understand the story of Equatorial Guinea and the misfortune is 1.8 million people continue to endure under this man, we need to go back to the beginning, right on the eve of independence. Equatorial Guinea was Spain's only African colony, but when the winds of decolonization swept across Africa in the 1960s, Spain reluctantly let go. After drafting a constitution for the country, the date for elections was fixed. This guy, Francisco Masias Nguema, was the Spanish choice for president. They had identified him as a rising star and groomed him for this moment, thinking he would be loyal to them and protect their interest. But when the time came for the campaigns, Masias turned on the Spanish. He campaigned as a fiery nationalist, promising crowds that he would hand them the keys to European-owned houses if he won. The election, which is still remembered to this day as the only truly free vote in the country's history, went to a runoff. But that didn't stop Masias defeating the more moderate Prime Minister Bonifacio Ondo Edu, and on October 12, 1968, that is the Independence Day, he was sworn in as Equatorial Guinea's first president. The atmosphere was hopeful. A new nation was born with a charismatic leader at the helm, but the joy of independence was short-lived for Equatorial Guinea, as Masias quickly turned into a brutal dictator with no regard for human lives. At first, Masias claimed he was cleaning up corruption. Then he started eliminating political opponents. But it didn't stop there. Within months, Masias began consolidating power with alarming ruthlessness. He banned all political parties except his own. Then he banned newspapers, then churches. He would eventually ban private education, claiming educated people were dangerous. In 1969, he quashed a rebellion led by his own foreign minister, executing about 100 people, including the minister himself. Soon enough, his paranoia spiraled out of control. He saw enemies everywhere and he turned his country into a prison. Masias would eventually replace the national motto with "There is no other God than Masias." Yes, that actually happened. Over a third of the population fled. Tens of thousands were killed. Teachers, doctors, even people who wore glasses, all targeted by Masias' regime. By the late 1970s, Masias was no longer running a country. It was a nightmare. However, while the entire country was gripped with fear of Francisco Masias Nguema, there was another Nguema in the shadows carrying out the orders of this brutal dictator. His name is Teodoro Obiang Nguema Mbasogo. Born in 1942, back when Equatorial Guinea was still Spanish Guinea, Teodoro Obiang is said to be the nephew of Francisco Masias Nguema. Like many elites in that era, he went through colonial military training, even attending Spain's elite military academy. So, when independence came along in 1968, Obiang was ready. He joined the new government, led by his uncle Masias, and quickly rose through the ranks. He became governor of Bioko Island, the wealthiest part of the country. Later, he was put in charge of the national prison system, including the notorious Black Beach prison. The place became a symbol of the regime's cruelty, all under the supervision of Teodoro Obiang. By the mid-1970s, the country's two banks, the Banco Exterior de España and the Banco de Crédito, were drained. With no money left, the government struggled to pay its own workers. Only 3 groups in Equatorial Guinea got paid: Masias Nguema, the army, and the police. Everyone else, sometimes they waited months, sometimes they just stopped waiting. The state was collapsing from within. Statisticians, that is people who track the data that helps run a country, were silenced. In fact, when the director of the Equatorial Guinea Institute of Statistics, Saturnin Antonio Ndongo, dared to publish population figures that Masias Nguema thought were too low, he was dismembered, officially to help him learn how to count. After 1973, private business was basically outlawed. Foreign investment dried up because Masias refused it. Exports were non-existent as all the skilled workers were either killed, in jail, or had fled the country. In fact, when the government introduced a new currency in 1975, the Ekwele, it collapsed almost immediately, and because there was no foreign exchange, they couldn't even replace it. Money as a concept stopped working. As the collapse continued, Masias saw enemies everywhere. Ministers, parliament members, even his own family. One by one, they were executed. By 1976, Masias went a step further. He made military training mandatory for all kids aged 7 to 14, and if their parents refused, jail or execution. Fearing that the Spanish wanted to overthrow him, Masias Nguema offered promotions and other rewards to anyone who would reveal a Spanish spy. This led to a climate of fear and suspicion, as owning the wrong book or having talked with the wrong person could result in punishment, imprisonment, or even death. Masias Nguema's repression went beyond just his citizens though. In 1976, Nigeria evacuated 45,000 contract laborers from the country, citing, quote, brutal ill-treatment, after his thugs killed Nigerian immigrant workers in the cocoa plantations who demanded higher wages. Even delegates from Nigeria's diplomatic mission were badly beaten in the capital Malabo. The brutality of Masias Nguema led to Equatorial Guinea being internationally nicknamed the Dachau of Africa by 1979. At least 60% of the population had fled the country. Masias Nguema had become increasingly withdrawn, often spending time mostly alone at his Mongoma villa. He would wander around repeatedly saying the names of his victims. Members of Masias Nguema's inner circle and government officials became more and more worried about his erratic behavior. At this point, the government had mostly ceased to function, as most ministers' posts were vacant, officials were no longer paid, and the National Assembly was effectively defunct. According to one report, the country's central bank even closed down after the murder of its governor. Masias Nguema kept what was left of the country's foreign reserves in his house, as the country's descent into Satan's dark abyss continued. Masias was being consumed by paranoia. He had declared himself a god. He trusted no one, not even his family. Soon enough, he began purging officials again. However, Masias lost the plot when he had a relative of Teodoro Obiang murdered. This would be an unforgivable mistake, one that eventually led to his end. On August 3rd, 1979, Obiang struck in a military coup aided by Spain. Right after this coup in August 1979, and for the first time in a decade, Spain regained its presence in the former colony. Obiang's rule had effectively begun. A Supreme Military Council was immediately set up, chaired by Lieutenant Colonel Teodoro Obiang Nguema. Obiang's government was quickly recognized by Spain and the Soviet Union. In a gesture to announce that he was different from his uncle, Obiang declared the release of all prisoners, lifted the ban on the Catholic Church, and resumed relations with the West. But just like his uncle before him, Teodoro Obiang banned all political parties. I guess he was not so different after all. In one of his first acts as president, Obiang staged one of modern history's most bizarre trials. His uncle, who had been shot while attempting to flee into the jungle carrying suitcases full of cash, was tried in a movie theater filled with 1,500 spectators who were treated to the sight of their former ruler hung from the ceiling in a cage. Following Masias' conviction, he was sentenced to death a record 101 times. This sentence was carried out by a firing squad composed of soldiers from Obiang's newly constituted Moroccan Presidential Guard. After this trial, Obiang proclaimed an amnesty to encourage Equatorial Guinean refugees to come back home. Approximately 5,000 political prisoners were released on that day. But as the honeymoon period drew to a close, Teodoro Obiang resumed his ruthless side that was known during his days as chief of Black Beach Prison. You see, while Obiang went about reversing the draconian rules of the previous regime in an effort to heal a broken nation, he conveniently stayed silent on his role in the atrocities committed by Masias. By 1982, the country had gradually returned to civilian rule with a new constitution that was less authoritarian. However, Obiang was somehow elected to a 7-year term as president in an election that had him as the only candidate. By 1987, Teodoro Obiang founded the country's only legal political party in preparations for the election in 1989. But again, he contested against himself with no opposition to his rule. Even after opposition parties were allowed in 1992, Obiang still managed to get re-elected in 1996 with 98% of the vote. Well, as the people of Equatorial Guinea continue to look forward to a change in their political fortunes, the 1990s came with great news, one that soon opened the country to the global economy. Following the collapse of a subsidized cocoa-rich export economy after independence in 1968, the economy of Equatorial Guinea crashed in the 1970s, followed by stagnation, limited economic activity, and high levels of poverty in the 80s. When Obiang came into power, the economic struggles continued, with the country depending mostly on foreign aid to pay its bills. All this changed, however, when large offshore oil reserves were discovered in the mid-1990s. Foreign oil companies, especially American firms like ExxonMobil and Marathon, flocked into the country. In a short time, Equatorial Guinea became one of Africa's top oil producers and the third largest in sub-Saharan Africa by the mid-2000s, and saw its GDP jump through the roof. By the 2000s, this nation of just over 1 million people was technically among the world's richest per capita, at least on paper. In fact, at one point, it was reported that Equatorial Guinea's oil income gave it the second highest per capita GDP in the world, that is around £26,000. This gave Obiang so much pride, with the regime hailing the country as the potential Kuwait of Africa. And just like Kuwait, Obiang began to build his family into a monarchy, effectively setting up a dynasty that will rule for generations.
Mr. President, there's a constitutional referendum, 2 7-year terms. Will you step down in 2016?
That's why I say it depends on the people.
How can it depend on the people? It's a law.
Because it's not a personal problem of my will, because we work based on the will of the people. The people decide.
By 2005, Teodoro Obiang had been in power for 26 years. But he was not willing to step aside, at least not just yet. He rather turned his attention into building a generational wealth for his family and close friends. Instead of bringing broad prosperity, the oil wealth became a tool for Obiang to tighten his grip on power. Virtually all oil revenue was declared a state secret under Obiang's personal control. The president and his inner circle treated the national treasury as their private bank account, while institutions that should provide accountability were removed from the way. Obiang built a patronage network with loyalists in the military, government, and ethnic clan, that is the Esangoi clan from his home region, turning millionaires overnight. Descent became even riskier as the regime's security forces, now flush with petrodollars, could expand their surveillance system, thereby increasing their repression capabilities. And while the West continued to care for democracy elsewhere, they largely turned a blind eye to the atrocities being committed by Obiang against his own people. For example, in 2002, President Bush and Obiang reportedly met for breakfast, although the White House refused to release photographs of that meeting. And then a year later in 2003, the US Embassy in Malabo was reopened. 3 years later, on the 12th of April 2006, Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice received President Obiang in Washington and said, quote, "You are a good friend and we welcome you." While the Washington elite decided to look the other way with regards to Obiang's human rights record, the Obiang regime was perfecting a culture of corruption back home, where large amounts of money were laundered between oil companies and the Obiang crime family. You see, US oil companies such as ExxonMobil, Hess, Marathon, Chevron Corporation, and Vanco Energy Corporation had poured a lot of money into Equatorial Guinea. The country soon became one of the main destinations of US investment on the continent. In fact, during the US-Iraq War, Equatorial Guinea became the major supplier of oil to the United States, all facilitated by the Bush administration. But most of the money that entered Equatorial Guinea ended up in the pockets of Obiang and his crime family. Let me show you the scale of corruption we are talking about here. According to Forbes magazine, President Obiang is among the world's richest heads of state with a fortune of over $600 million. But how did he manage to do this? In 2003, Obiang reportedly told his people that he felt compelled to take full control of the national treasury to prevent civil servants from being tempted to engage in corrupt practices. This was his explanation to records showing that between 1995 and 2004, much of the money extorted from the people of Equatorial Guinea by the Nguema/Mongomo group was deposited in this US bank known as Riggs Bank, located in Washington, D.C. The American bank Riggs was fully aware of the level of corruption and human rights concerns in Equatorial Guinea, yet they had no issues with Obiang banking with them. The president deposited more than $500 million in over 60 accounts controlled by himself and his family at Riggs Bank in Washington, D.C., while more than 3/4 of the population lived on less than $2 per day. Large amounts of the oil revenue were also siphoned into giant infrastructure projects overseen by contractors with ties to the administration. The government of Obiang only invested 2 to 3% of the budget into education and health. So, who benefits from the wealth of this tiny nation? Hang on, let me walk you through who is who in Obiang's crime family. This is Constancia Mangue, the first lady of Equatorial Guinea. At one point, 5 accounts and 3 certificates of deposit at Riggs Bank were held in Constancia's name, and ExxonMobil made several payments into these accounts. Andrew P. Swinger of ExxonMobil told investigators that his firm co-owned the Obiang energy firm Abayak with Constancia, who he said received 15% of all revenue from Abayak. A company called Nusitels GE, founded in 2000 to provide domestic telephone and computer services, is partly owned by the Obiangs through Abayak and partly owned by other high Equatorial officials. As of 2004, Abayak was the only construction company in all of Equatorial Guinea. This is Gabriel Mbanga Obiang Lima. He is President Obiang's son and also the Minister of Finance and Economy and Planning of Equatorial Guinea. Lima, whose mother is Obiang's second wife, Celestin Lima, has been called the Lord and Master of Equatorial Guinea's oil industry. He controlled the production of 500,000 barrels of oil per day and traveled frequently to countries like Angola, Malaysia, France, China, even the United States, Canada, Brazil, Britain, Switzerland, and Trinidad and Tobago, where he is said to own lucrative business partners and, in some cases, numbered bank accounts and safe deposit boxes. There's another one known as Candido Nsue Okomo, the First Lady's brother. Until early 2015, Candido Nsue Okomo served as head of the state-owned oil company, GE Petrol. Reports claim that foreign oil executives complained that Okomo made unreasonable demands of them and hindered investments in the country. And then there is Ruthless Obiang, a son of the president who was at one point Equatorial Guinea's Secretary of State for Sports and Youth. He has lived in Spain, where he encouraged firms to do business in his country. Well, several Spanish businessmen, however, have come out to complain about the consequences of these deals. One Spaniard who allegedly paid $200,000 to secure a contract to build soccer stadiums described a system that involved bribes at every turn. After paying bribes for years, however, his deal eventually fell apart when he refused to pay any more bribes to Ruthless Obiang and his associates. The businessman was critical of business in the country, saying officials exploit as much money as possible until moving on to another contractor. Then there is the heir apparent to the throne, Teodoro Obiang.
Obiang has now landed himself in another controversy. This after he stayed in believe it or not, a $75,000 per night penthouse, where he had flown to New York to call for more financial aid for his country.
When President Obiang appointed his son as his vice president, it was clear that the family was setting the stage for a continuation of the dynasty by maintaining control of Equatorial Guinea for a third straight generation. However, Teodoro's preparation for leadership has been complicated by international legal troubles stemming from his extravagant lifestyle funded by state resources. Multiple courts in the United States, Switzerland, Spain, and France have found him guilty of misappropriating public funds. Despite these legal challenges abroad, however, Teodoro seemed to be doing just fine within Equatorial Guinea. Teodoro Nguema Obiang Mange has been appointed to numerous government positions by his father's regime, including advisor to the presidency in the 1990s, Minister of Agriculture and Forestry, a post he held for about 15 years, and then second vice president in charge of defense and security in May 2012. After 4 years as second vice president, he was promoted to the position of first vice president in June 2016. This move, which followed his father's re-election in the April 2016 presidential election, made him the next in line to succeed his father. He was also in charge of the Ministry of National Defense and Security in 2018 and leads the country's Anti-Corruption Commission set up in May 2022. This is like a thief being commissioned to catch thieves, albeit in a different location. You see, the heir apparent to the presidency, Teodoro, has been described as fantastically corrupt and has been called an unstable, reckless idiot by a former US intelligence official. According to the US Assistant Attorney General Leslie Caldwell, Teodoro shamelessly looted his government and shook down businesses in his country to support his lavish lifestyle, all while many of his fellow citizens lived in extreme poverty. Although Teodoro's annual salary was about $100,000, he had managed to accumulate a fortune of over $300 million, including major US assets owned and acquired through shell companies and third parties. The US Department of Justice accused Teodoro of carrying out corruption schemes and charging businesses illegal commissions. Now, we need to establish here that these are not mere accusations. There have been investigations carried out with evidence to show the activities of this crime family. Investigations that reveal the complicity of foreign companies, bankers, and governments, including the United States. According to investigators, US lawyers, bankers, and real estate and escrow agents helped Teodoro move over $110 million through US bank accounts between 2004 and 2008. From 1998 to 2006, he owned a mansion on a 16-acre estate at 3620 Sweetwater Mesa Road in the private gated community of Sierra Retreat in Malibu, a city in California. This house was purchased through his company Sweetwater Mesa LLC, which in April 2006 sold the property to another of his shell firms, Sweetwater Malibu LLC. The $35 million purchase price made it the sixth costliest home purchase in the US after 2006. It was also the most expensive home purchase in California in 2006. But Teodoro is not just in the business of collecting houses. Boy does he love to party, and party he does in style. When he wants to relax, Teodoro has lots of female companions in Southern California, including a porn actress, a former Playboy Playmate of the Month, and a Grammy-winning rapper and actress named Eve, whom he appointed as president, treasurer, and CFO of one of his shell companies, Sweet Pink. He also secured female party guests from escort agencies. In 2005, he paid $700,000 to rent a yacht from Microsoft's Paul Allen for a party. In 2009, he spent a month on Maui, flying there on his Gulfstream 5, chartering another jet for employees, while also bringing along escort girls, sport cars, and a speedboat. Senate investigators found he spent $59,850 for rugs, $58,000 for a home theater, and $1,734 for a pair of wine glasses. At one point, he owned 32 motorcycles and automobiles in California, including 7 Ferraris, 5 Bentleys, 4 Rolls Royce, 2 Lamborghinis, 2 Maybachs, 2 Mercedes, 2 Porsche, and 1 Aston Martin, and 1 Bugatti, with a collective insured value of $9.5 million. This is the vice president of Equatorial Guinea. But his activities are not confined to the US alone. In late 2010, Teodoro shipped his collection of sport cars and $400,000 worth of motorcycles from Los Angeles to France for a time. He lived at a Paris hotel, from where he went shopping for over 30 designer suits. As of 2012, he owned a 5-story mansion on Paris Swank Avenue, Foch, where he had kept 11 luxury cars, including a Maserati and an Aston Martin, until French police seized them in late 2011 or early 2012. And when he's tired of Europe, he jets out to South Africa, where in 2004, he purchased 2 homes in Cape Town, worth a total of $7 million, and also spent almost $1.45 million on 3 cars. You see, there have been numerous international investigations into Teodoro Obiang, Nguema, Mbasogo, and his family, primarily focusing on allegations of corruption, embezzlement, and money laundering. But the most interesting of all was the Riggs Bank scandal, as it gave details of the family's financial transactions. The US Senate's Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations held a hearing on July 15, 2004, titled Money Laundering and Foreign Corruption, Enforcement and Effectiveness of the Patriot Act, case study involving Riggs Bank. This hearing detailed Riggs Bank's involvement in facilitating suspicious financial activities for foreign officials in Equatorial Guinea. In 1995, Riggs Bank opened its first embassy account for Equatorial Guinea. Over the next 8 years, the bank opened more than 50 additional accounts and a dozen certificates of deposit for not only the government of Equatorial Guinea now, but also a host of senior government officials and their family members. By 2003, the Equatorial Guinea account had become the bank's largest single relationship, with balances and outstanding loans that together approached $700 million. The subcommittee investigation determined that Riggs Bank serviced the accounts with little or no attention to the bank's anti-money laundering obligations, turned a blind eye to evidence suggesting the bank was handling the proceeds of foreign corruption, and allowed numerous suspicious transactions to take place without notifying law enforcement. The US Senate probe determined that Equatorial Guinea's oil revenues account at Riggs Bank was controlled by 3 persons: President Obiang, Africa's longest-serving dictator, his son, Gabriel Obiang Lima, who was Minister of Mines, and his nephew, Melcho Esono Ejo, who was Secretary of State for Treasury and Budget. Now, let me walk you through some incredible transactions from these bank accounts. This document here is available on the US government website. I'll provide a link to it in the description box below. According to the US Senate Committee, Riggs failed to conduct routine or special reviews of wire transfer activity, even for his high-risk accounts. This was until the bank was forced under pressure to look into the frequent and sizable transfers of funds across international lines. In August 2003, after Riggs finally bowed to pressure, They hired an experienced investigator to conduct an in-depth review of the Equatorial Guinea accounts over the next few months. This investigator identified numerous suspicious wire transactions involving the Equatorial Guinea oil accounts. These transactions included, for example, wire transfers totaling nearly $35 million from the Equatorial Guinea oil account to two companies that were unknown to the bank and had bank accounts in jurisdictions with bank secrecy laws. There were also 3 wire transfers totaling more than $1 million that were sent to Jardini Holdings, an offshore shell corporation owned by the wife of the Equatorial Guinea account manager at Riggs, and 3 transfers totaling nearly $500,000 that were sent to the personal bank accounts of a senior Equatorial Guinea official. Between June 2000 to December 2003, 16 wire transfers were sent from the Equatorial Guinea oil account to Kolunga Company SA, an Equatorial Guinea corporation. The amounts totaled over $26.5 million. I've highlighted the transactions along with dates here for you to see. All of these wire transfers were sent from Riggs to a Kolunga Company account at Banco Santander in Madrid, Spain. There are other wire transfers highlighted in this document. But the family didn't do this alone. They had help. So who were the enablers of this corruption? In the United States, we had Riggs Bank that held close to $700 million for the Obiang family network. Court records also implicated a former Soviet diplomat, Vladimir Kokorev, as a key player in Obiang's network. In 2015, Kokorev and his wife Yulia and son Igor were arrested in Panama on charges from Spain, with reports claiming are related to the looting of Equatorial Guinea. The Spanish non-governmental organization had filed a civil claim against the Kokorevs for money laundering for the Obiangs. There is also a network in Lithuania. Vladimir Stefanov linked to both the Kokorevs and the Obiangs via documents assigning power of attorney, contracts and businesses. Since 1999, Stefanov, together with Yulia Vladimir Kokorev, managed a Panamanian company called International Shipping Advisors SA. This company was established by Ismail Galik Chamsor, a Panamanian lawyer who worked for the Kokorevs and was later subpoenaed by Spanish authorities in December 2015 to provide information. However, with all of these allegations and evidence to back them up, the government of Equatorial Guinea continues to deny all wrongdoing. What they fail to understand, though, is the human cost of all of this. You see, while Obiang and family continue to use international organizations and functions to whitewash their terrible records back home, the people are suffering from severe poverty. More than 70% of Equatorial Guinea's population lives in poverty. According to the IMF, government expenditures on health from 1992 to 1996 averaged 6.43% of total outlays. But between 1997, when oil revenue started flowing in, and 2002, government expenditure on health declined to an average of 1.23%. A similar downward trend occurred in government spending on education during the same period. Education expenditures used to average 6.79% of total outlays between 1992 to 1996, while from 1997 to 2002, the average dropped to only 1.67%. A year later in 2003, the US Department of State was critical of Equatorial Guinea's spending on social services, saying that, quote, "There is little evidence that the country's oil wealth is being devoted to the public good." Yet, this same US government has failed to call for true democracy in Equatorial Guinea, whatever that means these days. So my question is, what will it take to liberate the people of Equatorial Guinea from this family dynasty that has been ongoing for 57 years?